Most people think power looks loud. Flashy suits, security details, cameras. But real power usually wears muddy boots and smells like diesel smoke. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Burnt corn dust has this bitter scent that sticks to the back of your throat like old pennies and charcoal mixed together. It rolled across my property in thick waves as I stepped out onto the porch at 2:13 in the morning, cold Iowa wind pushing smoke through the cornfields under a silver moon. Then I saw the glow. Orange flames punched through the darkness behind the south field where my father's old corn barn stood. For a second, I just listened. Drywood popping, tin roofing groaning from the heat. The distant hiss of crickets suddenly silenced by the fire. My boots crushed frozen gravel as I walked toward the blaze, slow and steady, the way you walk toward something you already know is gone. Halfway there, headlights bounced across the edge of the property. White Lexus SUV. Expensive. Clean enough to reflect the firelight off the paint. It sat near the county road for maybe 3 seconds before pulling away. But I caught enough. Blonde hair behind the wheel. White knuckles gripping the steering wheel. Brenda Holloway never liked getting dirt on her tires unless it was attached to profit. The barn roof collapsed inward with a deep metallic shriek that echoed across 200 acres of frozen farmland. Sparks exploded upward like fireflies. Heat slapped against my face hard enough to sting my eyes. That barn had stood there since 1974. My father built it with his bare hands after coming home from Vietnam. I still remembered the smell of sawdust in the summer air when I was a kid handing him crooked nails from an old coffee can. Every winter storm, every flood, every bad harvest. That barn survived all of it. Until tonight. Red and blue lights finally appeared down the road 10 minutes later, sirens muted against the wind. Volunteer firefighters dragged hoses through muddy soil while half-awake deputies wandered around pretending this was routine. Brenda arrived right behind them wearing a cream-colored coat, and fake concern stretched across her face like cheap paint over rotten wood. "Nathan," she said softly, touching my arm like we were neighbors instead of enemies. "Oh my God, this is heartbreaking." Her perfume mixed with smoke and wet ash until the air itself felt poisonous. I looked at her without blinking. The flames reflected in her eyes, dancing bright and nervous. She kept talking anyway. Something about faulty wiring, old buildings, safety hazards. I barely heard it, because buried underneath the crackling timber and the hiss of steam, I heard something else. Opportunity. You see, Brenda Holloway thought she'd finally scared an old farmer into selling his land. She thought burning my barn would make me fold like everyone else in this county. What she didn't understand was that the moment those flames touched that building, this stopped being a property dispute. It became a federal matter. And by sunrise, the woman who ruled our little HOA like a suburban queen was going to learn exactly why federal judges don't raise their voices when they're angry. By dawn, the fire was mostly gone, but the smell stayed. Wet ash, burned cedar, melted insulation. It clung to my clothes while I stood beside the ruins holding a paper cup of stale gas station coffee that had already gone cold in my hands. Frost covered the edge of the cornfield in thin silver lines, sparkling under the first gray light of morning. The barn looked smaller now. Fires do that to old places. They shrink memories down into blackened beams and smoking dirt. Deputy Collins shuffled across the mud toward me with his notepad tucked under one arm. 28 years old, fresh academy haircut, trying very hard to sound important. "Looks accidental so far, Mr. Mercer," he said. "These older electrical systems can get dangerous." I looked past him toward the tire tracks near the county road. Fresh tread. Expensive, all-season tires. Wide spacing. Luxury SUV. Rainwater had not touched them yet. "Interesting," I said quietly, considering that barn did not have electricity anymore. Collins froze for half a second before clearing his throat. "Well, the investigators will determine all that." The investigators. Small town code for people who already decided the answer. Before showing up, I took another sip of coffee and tasted smoke instead of caffeine. Across the field, Brenda stood beside 2 HOA board members near her Lexus pretending to comfort them while they stared at my property like tourists watching a roadside attraction. Every few seconds, her eyes drifted toward me, measuring, calculating, waiting to see if I looked broken yet. That was her favorite part. Brenda Holloway did not just want control. She wanted surrender. Most people in Cedar Ridge gave it to her eventually. The retired couples with fixed incomes, young families scared of legal fees, farmers drowning in taxes, and bad weather. Brenda always smiled while she tightened the screws. That was what made her dangerous. My father used to say you should never trust someone whose shoes stay clean around a farm. Brenda's white leather boots looked spotless standing 20 feet from fresh ash and mud. Around 7:30, the county fire investigator finally arrived in a silver pickup truck with zoning office decals on the side. That caught my attention immediately. County zoning and fire investigations were not supposed to overlap. But around Cedar Ridge, Brenda's husband managed to make rules bend like cheap aluminum siding. Investigator Dale Harmon stepped out carrying a clipboard and the smell of cigarette smoke. Late 50s, thick stomach, eyes that never looked directly at anything too long. Terrible situation, he muttered while walking the perimeter without writing a single note. Then he stopped near the foundation and frowned. Not at the burn pattern, not at the collapsed roof, at the basement hatch. Even buried under debris, the steel door remained visible beneath the wreckage. My pulse slowed instead of rising. Funny thing about spending 22 years on the federal bench. You learn exactly when people start realizing they stepped into something bigger than expected. Harmon glanced toward Brenda for the briefest moment before speaking again. You keep anything important down there? He asked casually. I let the silence stretch between us while cold wind pushed smoke across the field. Then I answered honestly. Enough to ruin several careers. 4. The first time all morning, somebody stopped pretending this was an accident. Harmon's jaw tightened. Brenda stopped talking mid-sentence near the road. Even the deputies suddenly looked less comfortable standing on my land. And somewhere deep underneath the wreckage, hidden below 40 years of corn dust and old lumber, the steel lockbox inside that basement was still intact. The wind shifted around noon and carried the smell of burned corn clear across Cedar Ridge. By then, half the town already knew my barn was gone. Small towns move information faster than wildfires. Somebody's cousin sees smoke, somebody's barber repeats it over coffee, and suddenly every gas station cashier within 20 miles becomes an expert investigator. I spent most of that afternoon clearing debris with an old steel rake while clouds rolled low over the fields. Wet ash stuck to my gloves. Charred nails crunched beneath my boots. Every now and then, I caught people slowing their cars near the road just to stare. Nobody stopped. Nobody offered help. Around here, folks learned long ago that getting between Brenda Holloway and one of her targets usually ended badly for everybody involved. By 3 o'clock, Brenda decided it was time for her performance. I heard the smooth hum of her Lexus before I saw it. The SUV rolled up my gravel driveway slow enough to make a point, tires crunching across blackened debris near the barn site. She stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses and a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly diesel bill. Perfect hair, perfect smile, perfect suburban predator. Nathan, she called gently, like we were old church friends. I wanted to personally stop by and say how sorry I am about this terrible tragedy. The word tragedy nearly made me laugh. Instead, I leaned against the tailgate of my truck and watched her carefully. Brenda always talked too much when she was nervous. County investigators think faulty storage conditions may have contributed, she continued. Old agricultural buildings can become liabilities, especially this close to residential expansion zones. There it was. Expansion zones. That was the real reason she came. Not sympathy, not curiosity. She wanted to see if the fire finally pushed me into selling. Behind her, the western edge of Cedar Ridge Estates sat spread across what used to be Miller farmland. Identical gray houses lined up like cardboard displays under the cloudy sky. Tiny decorative trees. Tiny mailboxes. Tiny lives hidden behind expensive fences and HOA rules thick as phone books. Brenda had spent the last 3 years trying to drag suburban development across every acre surrounding my property. Golf course proposals, luxury retirement villas, boutique shopping plans. According to her, my farm was ruining the county's future. According to me, she could choke on it. You know, Brenda said while stepping closer, developers are still willing to make very generous offers for your land despite everything. I could smell her perfume fighting against the smoke still hanging in the cold air. Vanilla and something sharp underneath it, like chemicals trying to imitate flowers. That barn was old, she added softly. Maybe this is the universe telling you it is time to move on. I looked past her toward the subdivision where identical roofs stretched across the horizon. Then I looked back at the ashes where my father's barn used to stand. My father built that structure after surviving Vietnam, I said quietly. Tornadoes could not take it down. Floods could not take it down. 40 Iowa winters could not take it down. Brenda's smile stiffened just slightly. Well, she said carefully, sometimes unfortunate things simply happen. The silence afterward felt heavy enough to bend steel. A crow landed on the burned fence post beside us, black feathers rustling in the wind. Somewhere down the road, I heard a nail gun hammering away inside one of Brenda's precious new developments. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen, and for the first time since arriving, genuine panic flickered across her face. Just for a second. Tiny, but real. She turned the phone away quickly, too quickly. Federal area code. Washington, District of Columbia. Interesting. Brenda cleared her throat and slipped the phone back into her purse. Anyway, she said, forcing her smile back into place, I am sure the investigation will clear everything up soon. I nodded slowly. Oh, it definitely will. She did not realize it yet, but somewhere underneath the burned remains of that barn sat documents connected to a federal corruption case already active in 3 states. And if even one page inside that lockbox had been damaged, every person connected to this fire was about to discover exactly how unpleasant the federal court system could become. The next morning arrived hard and gray, the kind of Iowa morning where the sky looks like wet concrete stretched across the horizon. Cold wind rolled through the cornfields, carrying the damp smell of ash straight into town. I woke before sunrise like always, pulled on my work jacket, and walked out onto the porch with black coffee steaming in my hand. Across the property, the remains of the barn sat under a layer of frost and soot, skeletal beams reaching upward like burned fingers. But something else caught my attention first. Tire tracks. Fresh ones. 2 separate vehicles had entered my land sometime during the night. The mud near the south field still glistened from the pressure marks. Somebody had come back after the fire. That told me more than any investigation report ever could. Innocent people do not revisit crime scenes at 2 in the morning. I followed the tracks toward the old irrigation ditch while crows circled overhead, making enough noise to scrape against my nerves. About halfway there, I spotted it hanging from my mailbox. Bright yellow violation notice. The paper snapped violently in the wind like it was proud of itself. I pulled it free and read the bold black letters across the top. Unsafe structural conditions. Emergency property review. Authority granted by Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I actually smiled at that. Brenda moved fast when she smelled weakness. 24 hours after my barn burned down, she was already trying to declare the property hazardous so county developers could pressure me into forced sale negotiations. Efficient, ruthless, predictable. The paper smelled like fresh printer ink and cheap perfume. Brenda probably hand-delivered it herself. Around 8 o'clock, the county zoning department arrived in full parade formation. 3 trucks. For inspectors. Clipboards everywhere. They marched across my farm wearing polished boots that sank into mud every 6 feet. One younger guy nearly lost his balance stepping over a frozen rut near the cornfield. City people always underestimate farmland until it grabs them by the ankles. Their supervisor introduced himself as Martin Keene, though his nervous eyes kept drifting toward the subdivision road where Brenda's Lexus sat parked beneath a row of decorative maple trees. Watching. Waiting. Mr. Mercer, Keene said while adjusting his gloves. We received reports that your property may present environmental safety concerns after the fire. From whom? I asked calmly. He hesitated. Concerned residents. Concerned residents. Another small-town phrase that usually means Brenda Holloway and whoever still fears her enough to nod along. Keene continued reading from his clipboard while wind rattled loose sheet metal nearby. There are also pending discussions regarding agricultural rezoning in this district. There it was again. Rezoning. Brenda's favorite word. She talked about rezoning the way normal people talked about weather. Casual. Constant. Dangerous. I looked out toward the subdivision where identical vinyl fences lined up beneath the cloudy sky, like prison walls painted beige. 5 years ago, this entire area had been soybean fields and cattle pasture. Then Cedar Ridge Estates arrived promising economic growth and luxury living. What actually arrived was lawsuits, HOA fines, and people calling the sheriff because somebody painted their mailbox the wrong shade of white. Keen cleared his throat awkwardly. Depending on the structural assessment, there may be recommendations concerning property transfer opportunities. I stared at him long enough to make him uncomfortable. You should be very careful with your wording, son. The cold silence afterward hit harder than the wind. One inspector stopped writing entirely. Another suddenly became very interested in his boots. Then a black SUV appeared at the far edge of my driveway. Not county, not local police. Federal. Plates. Clean government issue. The vehicle rolled slowly toward us through the gravel, while every person standing there unconsciously straightened their posture. Funny thing about federal vehicles. People recognize authority before they even see badges. Keen swallowed hard as the SUV stopped beside the burned barn. Two men stepped out wearing dark coats despite the cold. Neither looked at the zoning inspectors first. Both looked directly at me. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I watched real fear crawl across Brenda Holloway's face from over 300 yards away. The taller federal agent stepped out first, polished black shoes sinking slightly into the mud beside my burned barn. He moved with the kind of calm confidence that only comes from carrying authority nobody questions twice. Dark wool coat. Silver hair at the temples. No wasted motion. The second man stayed near the SUV scanning the property while cold wind pushed smoke across the fields behind us. Every county inspector suddenly looked like kids caught cheating on a test. Martin Keene lowered his clipboard so fast it nearly slipped from his gloves. "Good morning," the taller agent said while approaching me. "Judge Mercer." Just like that. One sentence. One word. And the entire atmosphere changed. You could actually feel it happen. Brenda stood frozen near the subdivision entrance almost 300 yards away, but even from that distance I saw the exact moment her confidence cracked. Her posture stiffened. Her sunglasses came off slowly. Keene blinked twice like his brain needed time to rearrange reality. "Judge," he repeated quietly. The federal agent reached into his coat and handed me a sealed envelope. Official Department of Justice markings across the front. Heavy paper. Washington return address. I recognized the signature immediately. Assistant Attorney General Robert Gaines. The same man who spent 8 months building a federal corruption case connected to illegal land acquisitions across Iowa, Nebraska, and Missouri. The same investigation whose backup evidence had been sitting inside the basement lockbox beneath my barn. "We received your emergency message at 6:40 this morning," the agent said calmly. "Washington authorized immediate retrieval operations." Keene looked like he wanted to disappear directly into the dirt beneath his boots. I did not realize." "No," I said quietly while opening the envelope. "You clearly did not." The cold air carried the smell of wet ash and diesel fuel while pages shifted beneath my fingers. Federal Recovery Authorization. Evidence Protection Order. Temporary Jurisdiction Transfer. Exactly what I expected. Around us, county inspectors suddenly found very important reasons to stop talking. Nobody wants to stand too close when federal paperwork starts appearing. Funny thing about power. Real power rarely raises its voice. It just changes the room temperature. The second federal agent moved toward the burned foundation and crouched beside the steel basement hatch partially buried under debris. "Heat damage appears minimal," he called out. "Lock integrity still intact." "Good. Very good." Because inside that lockbox sat financial records, zoning communications, wire transfer copies, and sworn testimony connected to a network of county officials laundering developer money through shell companies disguised as residential expansion projects. Brenda Holloway thought she was bullying one stubborn farmer. What she actually touched was federal evidence tied to a grand jury investigation already active in 2 federal districts. I glanced toward her again. She was walking toward us now, quick sharp steps across the edge of the property, expensive boots sinking into mud she probably hated touching. "Nathan," she called out, forcing a shaky smile onto her face. "What exactly is going on here?" The taller federal agent turned before I answered. "Ma'am, this property is now under federal protection pending active investigation." Brenda stopped cold. "Federal?" she repeated weakly. Her voice sounded smaller now, less polished, less certain. "There must be some misunderstanding. We were told this was simply an agricultural fire." I folded the authorization papers carefully while wind rattled the remaining metal siding behind us. "No," I said calmly. "What burned here last night contained protected Federal evidence connected to an ongoing criminal investigation. Silence swallowed the property after that. Even the crows stopped making noise. Brenda's face drained of color so fast it looked painful. Her eyes flickered toward the burned barn, then toward the basement hatch, then back to me. And in that exact moment, she finally understood the scale of her mistake. Not fully, not yet, but enough. Enough to realize the quiet old farmer she spent 3 years harassing was not simply another landowner she could pressure into submission. Enough to understand why federal agents were standing in muddy Iowa farmland calling me Judge Mercer instead of Mr. The taller agent adjusted his gloves and looked directly at Brenda. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "from this point forward, you are advised not to leave the county without notifying federal authorities." Brenda tried to recover fast. I will give her that. Some people collapse when fear hits them. Brenda Holloway adjusted her sweater, lifted her chin, and reached for arrogance like it was muscle memory. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, voice sharper now. "Nathan has lived here for years pretending to be some retired farmer. Nobody said anything about federal investigations." The taller agent barely looked at her. "Federal judges are not required to announce themselves to homeowners associations, ma'am." That line landed harder than a hammer. Even the county inspectors looked away to hide their reactions. Brenda opened her mouth again, then closed it. For the first time since I met her 3 years earlier, she had absolutely no control over the conversation happening around her. The wind picked up across the fields, rattling loose sheet metal beside the burned foundation, while federal agents began setting orange evidence markers through the debris. One marker near the south wall, another near the collapsed entrance, then a third beside the muddy tire tracks leading toward the county road. Brenda noticed those markers too. Her breathing changed slightly after that. Faster, less steady. "This is insane," she muttered quietly. "We were trying to improve this community." Improve. That word again. Brenda always dressed. Greed in prettier language. Improvement. Progress. Beautification. She talked about farmland the same way people talk about outdated furniture. Something old that needed replacing. I watched one of the federal agents carefully clear ash away from the steel basement hatch using gloved hands and a small brush. Underneath the soot, the lock remained untouched. Heavy industrial steel. Fireproof sealed hinges. My father installed it back in 1998 after a tornado tore through the county. "Always protect what matters twice," he used to tell me. Smart man. Around noon, another convoy arrived. 2 black SUVs. 1 unmarked truck. United States Marshals this time. Their jackets carried that unmistakable federal lettering across the chest that tends to make local officials suddenly remember every questionable decision they ever made. Deputy Collins nearly tripped over a hose backing out of their way. Brenda's husband finally showed up 10 minutes later looking pale enough to match the cloudy sky overhead. Charles Holloway stepped out of his Cadillac Escalade already sweating despite the cold. County Zoning Commissioner. Expensive watch. Perfect haircut. Eyes darting everywhere except toward the evidence markers. "Nathan," he called carefully while approaching me. "Surely we can clear up whatever misunderstanding this is." I stared at him long enough to make him uncomfortable. Charles always smelled faintly of cigar smoke and expensive cologne, like a man trying very hard to appear more powerful than he actually was. "Misunderstanding," I repeated calmly. "Your zoning department inspected my property less than 12 hours after a suspicious fire connected to an active federal evidence site." His face tightened immediately. "I did not know there was any federal connection." "That is because you never asked." The silence after that stretched across the field like incoming weather. One of the marshals walked past carrying a hardened black case recovered from beneath the barn. Soot covered the outside, but the federal evidence seal remained intact. Good. Very good. Because inside that case sat years of financial records tied to developer kickbacks routed through. Shell corporations connected directly to county rezoning approvals, including several approvals signed personally by Charles Holloway. Brenda noticed the case immediately. So did her husband. And suddenly both of them looked like people realizing the walls around them were not as solid as they once believed. The taller federal agent opened the rear door of the SUV and removed another folder thick enough to stop a bullet. Red tabs. Grand jury documentation. Federal warrants waiting for signatures. The smell of cold diesel exhaust drifted through the air while marshals quietly spread across the property perimeter. Nobody spoke much anymore. Fear tends to silence people faster than authority does. Brenda finally looked directly at me again, and this time there was no suburban confidence left in her expression. Only panic trying very hard to stay hidden. "Nathan," she said softly, almost pleading now, "you cannot seriously think we had anything to do with this fire." I slid my hands into my coat pockets and looked out across the burned remains of my father's barn, while smoke still curled into the gray Iowa sky. "Mrs. Holloway," I said quietly, "I spent 22 years listening to people lie under oath. Trust me when I tell you this." I finally turned toward her completely. The ones who panic first are usually the ones already calculating prison time. By sunset, Cedar Ridge no longer felt like a quiet farming town. It felt like a courthouse hallway 5 minutes before a guilty verdict. Federal vehicles lined the edge of my property, while portable floodlights illuminated the burned remains of the barn in harsh white beams that cut through the gathering darkness. The smell of wet ash still lingered in the air, mixing with diesel exhaust and the bitter scent of approaching snow. Across the subdivision, curtains kept moving inside expensive homes, neighbors pretending not to watch. Nobody in Cedar Ridge had ever seen this many federal agents in one place before, especially not surrounding the property of the man they thought was just some stubborn widower living alone beside a cornfield. I stood near the burned foundation, holding another cup of stale coffee while agents cataloged evidence around the basement hatch. Every now and then, the metallic click of cameras echoed through the cold air. Documentation, procedure, patience. Federal investigations move slowly until they suddenly move all at once. Brenda and Charles remained parked near the county road for almost an hour after the marshals arrived. They stayed inside the Escalade most of that time, probably making calls to lawyers, developers, or whatever county officials still answered their phones. But panic has a smell to it. Sharp, sour. Nervous people always roll their windows down too often, even when it is freezing outside. Around 7:15, Charles finally stepped out again and approached the federal command vehicle with forced confidence stretched across his face. I watched him carefully from a distance. One marshal blocked his path immediately. Short conversation. Tense posture. Charles gesturing toward my property while trying too hard to smile. Then the marshal handed him a printed notice. Even from 50 yards away, I recognized the red federal seal across the top. Preservation order. Charles read exactly 3 lines before the color disappeared from his face again. He turned fast after that and walked back toward the Escalade with the stiff mechanical movements of a man trying not to unravel in public. Brenda climbed out before he reached the vehicle. The two of them argued quietly near the roadside beneath the subdivision entrance sign she fought so hard to install 2 years earlier. Cedar Ridge Estates. Luxury country living. Funny slogan considering half the county now associated the place with investigations and federal agents. Wind rattled the sign hard enough to make the decorative chains clink together like nervous teeth. The taller federal agent walked over beside me and handed me a pair of black leather gloves. "You may want these," he said calmly. "The evidence team is ready to open the lockbox." The cold metal handle of the basement hatch groaned as agents pulled it upward beneath the floodlights. Steam drifted from the scorched concrete below. One agent descended first carrying a flashlight, while everybody above ground fell silent. Even the wind seemed quieter for a few seconds. Then his voice echoed upward from below. "Box is intact. Good. Very good." A second agent carefully carried the hardened steel case out of the basement and placed it onto a folding evidence table beside the barn ruins. Burn marks streaked the exterior, but the locking mechanism remained untouched. I entered the code myself. For slow numbers. The latch released with a heavy metallic click that seemed to stop every conversation within earshot. Inside sat rows of sealed folders, external hard drives, banking records, zoning maps, and printed communications tied to the federal corruption case. Years of evidence. Years of greed. Years of people like Brenda and Charles Holloway believing nobody important was watching them. The taller agent opened one folder and immediately exhaled through his nose. "Jesus," he muttered quietly while flipping through transfer records. Nearby marshals began exchanging looks with one another. One hard drive contained wire transfers connected to shell development companies. Another folder contained county rezoning approvals signed personally by Charles Holloway, less than 48 hours before anonymous developer donations appeared in private accounts. And sitting near the bottom of the lockbox was the document that changed everything. A printed email chain. Brenda Holloway discussing pressure tactics against landowners refusing to sell property near Cedar Ridge Estates. Including me. Including my barn. Including direct references to creating situations that would encourage faster relocation decisions. The taller agent closed the folder slowly and stared across the dark field toward the subdivision lights glowing in the distance. "Judge," he said carefully, "this just became conspiracy territory." I slipped my gloves off slowly while snowflakes finally began drifting through the cold Iowa night. "No," I answered quietly. "It became conspiracy territory the moment they stopped seeing other people as human beings." Snow covered the fields by morning. Thin white layers stretched across the burned remains of my barn like the land itself was trying to bury what happened there. But federal investigations do not disappear under snow. They spread. Quietly. Relentlessly. By 6:30 in the morning, Cedar Ridge Estates looked less like a luxury subdivision and more like the staging area for a political scandal. Black SUVs lined the neighborhood entrance beneath flashing amber lights, while marshals moved door to door carrying folders thick with warrants. The cold air smelled like pine mulch, diesel exhaust, and fear. Fear has a way of changing a neighborhood overnight. Curtains that usually stayed closed suddenly cracked open. Neighbors gathered on front porches clutching coffee mugs with trembling hands while federal agents photographed vehicles parked outside HOA board member homes. Nobody waved anymore. Nobody smiled. Around 7 o'clock, the first local news van arrived. Then another. Satellite dishes unfolded beside the subdivision entrance while reporters whispered excitedly into microphones wearing heavy winter coats and expressions usually reserved for tornado coverage. Cedar Ridge had spent years pretending to be the perfect suburban community. Turns out perfection collapses fast once federal agents start carrying evidence boxes out of million-dollar homes. I stood near my truck at the edge of the property, watching snowfall drift through the gray morning sky, while the taller federal agent reviewed documents beside me. "Search teams recovered financial records from 3 locations overnight," he said quietly, "including offshore transfer documentation." I nodded once. Not surprised. Greed almost always leaves a paper trail. The trick is waiting long enough for arrogant people to stop hiding it carefully. Across the road, Brenda Holloway stepped out of her house wearing dark sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. She moved quickly toward the federal perimeter line, boots crunching sharply against frozen gravel. Gone was the polished suburban queen who used to patrol HOA meetings like royalty inspecting peasants. This version looked exhausted. Hair rushed. Makeup uneven. Fear chewing through confidence one bite at a time. "Nathan," she called across the road, voice cracking slightly in the cold air, "this has gone far enough." One marshal immediately stepped between us, but I raised a hand gently. "It is all right." Brenda stopped several feet away, breathing hard while snowflakes melted against her coat sleeves. "You know Charles did not mean any harm," she said quickly. "Developers pressure everybody around here. We were trying to save the community." Save the community. Funny phrase coming from people who spent 3 years threatening retirees with fines over mailbox colors while quietly selling county land rights behind closed doors. I studied her silently while wind rattled the Cedar Ridge Estates entrance sign behind her. Somebody had already spray-painted fraud across the bottom overnight. Red paint dripping down expensive stonework like fresh embarrassment. Brenda noticed it too. Her jaw tightened. "You could stop this," she whispered desperately. "One statement from you, and the media frenzy dies down." That was the moment I realized Brenda still did not fully understand what was happening. She thought this investigation belonged to me personally, like I could simply decide whether laws mattered based on emotions. That mindset right there was exactly why people like her become dangerous once they taste local power. They stop believing rules apply equally anymore. Before I could answer, another marshal approached carrying a sealed evidence bag. Inside sat a partially melted gasoline container recovered less than a quarter-mile from my barn near the irrigation ditch. One side of the container carried a clean partial fingerprint. Brenda saw it immediately. Her breathing stopped for half a second. Tiny reaction, but enough. The marshal handed the evidence bag to the taller federal agent without saying a word. Snow continued falling around us, while reporters gathered farther down the road near the flashing lights. Cameras pointed toward the subdivision now, toward Brenda, toward Charles Holloway standing handcuffed beside a federal vehicle while agents escorted him through the snow-covered street he once controlled like his private kingdom. Neighbors watched from windows in stunned silence. Nobody came outside to defend him. Fear makes loyal people disappear very quickly. Brenda turned pale, enough to blend into the winter sky. "Nathan," she whispered again. I looked past her toward the burned remains of my father's barn barely visible through the snowfall across the field. "Mrs. Holloway," I said quietly, "you spent years believing intimidation was the same thing as authority." I finally looked directly into her eyes. "Now you get to learn the difference." 3 months later, the snow was gone and the cornfields had started turning green again. Spring sunlight rolled across the property in long golden waves while fresh lumber filled the air with the sharp, clean smell of sawdust and cedar. The new barn stood exactly where the old one had burned down, stronger this time. Steel-reinforced foundation, fireproof insulation, heavy oak beams cut from timber my father stored years ago behind the machine shed. Every hammer strike during construction sounded like closure. Slow, solid, earned. Cedar Ridge looked different now too. Quieter. Half the luxury development signs had disappeared after federal asset seizures froze the remaining projects tied to the investigation. Several homes sat empty behind dark windows and overgrown landscaping, while foreclosure notices fluttered in mailboxes up and down the subdivision. Funny how quickly perfection falls apart once the money behind it dries up. The Cedar Ridge Estate's entrance sign finally came down 2 weeks earlier. County workers hauled the cracked stone slabs away on flatbed trailers while a small crowd of neighbors watched silently from the roadside. Nobody complained. Nobody defended the old HOA board anymore. Most people just looked tired, embarrassed, relieved. Brenda Holloway had accepted a federal plea agreement after investigators recovered enough financial evidence to bury half the county administration beside her. Charles lost his zoning position before the formal charges even finished processing. Turns out local influence disappears fast once national news starts using words like corruption network and federal conspiracy. I never attended any of the hearings connected to their case. Did not need to. My courtroom sat nearly 200 miles away in Des Moines, and I preferred keeping it that way. Some people expected revenge speeches or dramatic confrontations after everything that happened. Truth is, real justice usually feels quieter than people imagine. More paperwork than shouting. More silence than celebration. One warm Saturday afternoon, I stood inside the new barn listening to rain tap softly against the steel roof overhead. Fresh-cut pine scented the entire structure while dust floated through golden lights spilling from the upper windows. Near the back wall hung my father's old brass barn bell. Cleaned, polished, rehung exactly where it used to be. I reached up and rang it once. The deep metallic tone rolled across the property and out through the open fields like an old memory, finally returning home. For a second, I could almost hear my father's boots crossing the concrete floor again. The taller federal agent visited later that evening on his way back through Iowa. He leaned against the doorway holding a cup of black coffee while looking around the rebuilt structure. "Looks good, Judge," he said quietly. I nodded once. "It will last." Rain continued falling softly outside, while thunder rumbled far across the horizon. The kind of peaceful storm farmers actually appreciate. Good growing weather. "You know," the agent added carefully, "Washington still cannot believe none of those people ever bothered checking who you were." I looked out across the fields where young corn stalks moved gently beneath the rain and fading sunlight. "Most people do not," I answered calmly. That was the point. He laughed softly at that before climbing back into his SUV and disappearing down the gravel road. The sound of tires faded slowly into the evening until all that remained was rain against the roof and wind moving through the fields. I stayed there a while longer, standing inside the rebuilt barn while twilight settled over the farm. Same land, same soil, same